Welcome to the tutorial 3D Tools. In this tutorial, I'm going to go over the 4 tools that you'll use most often when manipulating your objects in 3D space. So the first thing we need to do is bring up the Advanced Animation toolbar, and we do that by going to Windows, Toolbars, Advanced Animation. So the moment that you change these layers to 3D, enabling the 3D, you're allowing these tools to also become 3D when that layer is selected. So the 4 tools that I mentioned are actually the Translate tool, the Rotation tool, the Scale tool, and the Transform tool down here. When we're doing positioning, be sure that the Animate mode is off so that all the movements you make are not being recorded as keyframes, as movements that you want to see animated. So the first thing we're going to take a look at is the Translation tool. So I'm going to click on it here. And go to the perspective view, and let's back up a little. All the same keyboard shortcuts will work for zooming in and zooming out. And I'm going to use Option Command to rotate. And you might notice that if you grab these rings, you can rotate in very specific directions. Or you can just do kind of a global rotation if you grab anywhere on this sphere. So with the Translate tool, so let me get a better perspective, you can see that 3 different arrows are protruding from the pivot point. And if you click on one of these arrows, it turns pink, and that means you can pull exclusively in that direction. Let's do it with this one here. So even though with the Transform tool, you'll see that you can pretty much drag anywhere, it's actually recommended to pull along planes. It becomes less confusing because sometimes when you're dragging in a random direction, you think you're going straight up or straight across parallel to the X or Y axes, but in fact you've made a slight rotation as well. So it's recommended to go along straight angular paths, and actually it's recommended not to do any of these transformations I'm showing you in the perspective view. So I'll show you later on where we're going to actually do the movement. So the next tool I'd like to talk about is the Rotation tool, so let's select that. And as you can see, instead of having 3 arrows, we actually have 3 circles that comprise a 3D sphere. Don't get it confused with the circle that you use also to manipulate the perspective view. So if you grab any of these circles and pull, you'll see that it will rotate in a very specific direction. So it's pretty intuitive how you'd use these tools. You can also add exact values into the fields in the Layer Properties panel. So for example, if we go down to Rotation, I'm going to check Euler angles. I can enter an exact 90-degree value for this axis. And I actually prefer to work that way at the beginning when I'm making my base structure. And then with the details, I tend to use these transformation tools. The one thing that you might have to fool around with a little bit here is that you have to use the east-west, so cardinal coordinates, back-front for the z-axis, and north-south for up and down. So you might have to play around to see how big these values are, and you may have noticed that in scale you could do it in fields instead, so it's the 12-field scale. If you're not familiar with traditional animation, this might be equally as arbitrary as not having it scale in fields. So I really just fooled around with this value by making it 2 to see if it doubled it, or seeing if I could add decimal values, which you can for scaling, things like that. So it's not too complicated. Usually if you do a single test, you're able to tell what the value system is in these fields. So the next tool we're going to look at is the Scale tool. And I'm going to click Separate. Yeah, to bring up these little control points on the side. So let me rotate this again. So you can grab these control points to scale, to do the squash and stretch thing I was talking about, to scale ununiformly. I think I was just grabbing the edge, so it was actually scaling proportionally. You have to make sure the arrow is actually a double head, a direct double head, and not this kind of slanted double-headed arrow that's at a 45-degree angle so that you get your precise stretch or squash. And once again, like I said, you could also enter in values here. And the last tool is the transform tool, and this is the most powerful tool, but also the tool you have to be the most careful with. So if you select the transform tool, you'll see everything we saw before. You'll see the arrows coming out of the pivot point as it did with the translation tool. You'll see these ellipses or rings that you saw when we clicked on the rotation tool. You see the control points around a box. So this yellow box with the green and red control points that we saw when we tried to scale, but you see them all together, and that's why the transform tool is so powerful. So that's it for the tutorial 3D tools. Stay tuned for the next tutorial, positioning elements in 3D space.